people have been trying to do this for 10 years.
Yeah, but then they haven't done it very well. If there's a serious case and the evidence is clear, then it will be followed up. And all you have to do is find the one good man who will follow it up. I don't think there's likely to be so many teams implausible in extreme. I mean, it's impossible to know pretty well. I've seen all sorts of scams go on in government level. And the reaction of everybody that I went to with those scams when we first done the investigation was, oh, well, that can't be possible. The same reaction I'm giving to you now. And they were never right in my case. I never got to the point of saying that until I absolutely got it nailed down and prove it. And prove it to a state where I could go to the court and prosecute. That's the test you have to have. The test in a prosecution is you have to have a clear identity of somebody who has actually done the wrong thing. You can't prosecute the American government because a certain kind of military-grade explosive was found in the Twin Towers if it was found.
Yeah, but we can't even get an investigation.
Well, no, you can't.
Yeah, but we can't even get an investigation.
Well, no, you can't, because until you are able to identify it, essentially, no prosecutor is going to take on a case in that area where the standard of proof in a court is astronomical, quite rightly astronomical, because your constitutional system should be. The jury of his peers has got to buy it, there's got to be the evidence laid out, the balance of the burden of proof is entirely on the prosecution. That's a very high bar to jump, and no prosecutor is going to take that on unless and until you have got, first of all, you've got to be able to say who it was that committed the crime. You can't just say, oh, it was the government. They can't prosecute the government. They've got to have somebody who did the wrong thing. You've got to prove that somebody in the government knew about it, facilitated it, or didn't. Now, if you can't prove that, you've got nothing. Even if there was clearly a government conspiracy, even if there was, then the only way you will be able to make a case is by finding out who is the guilty party. Because without a name, who's the prosecutor going to prosecute? That's how you start with a name. Then you start with a crime. You have to establish that the name is connected to it. And then you have to prove that the name definitely did the crime. The perpetrator, what was happening. And you can't do that. You have nothing to protect the prosecutor. That's where I suspect you are at the moment. You probably don't have a name.
Well, maybe you're right. Maybe we've been going around this, we've been trying to get an investigation so that we come up with a name instead of coming up with it ourselves.
Well, you see, if you want to go down the prosecution route, you've got to have a name. If you think there's evidence that there was a conspiracy that needs to be investigated to find out who's behind it, then you've got to come up with very clear evidence that there is a link between whatever the facts of the conspiracy are and a particular class of persons who you suspect collectively may have been responsible, or somebody within that. You've got to provide some evidence, because otherwise people don't have the time. Nobody in the FBI investigates something purely on spec. They've got to have some sort of basis. I don't think you've got.
Well, we do. That's not a problem. We've got plenty of that.
No, you haven't. Because you haven't got the points that I'm saying.
Right, we don't have the person.
You haven't got, not just the person, you haven't even got a group of persons.
You may want to get a grand jury with subpoena power.
Yes, but then you've got to know who's subpoena, and until you've got further down the road, you can't talk about any of that. To establish a conspiracy, you would have to establish that what happens was not organised by the terrorists who were playing because they could just as easily put the thermite into the building as well, so that when the plane flew into the building, it would not and until you've got evidence that was done, you can't just say, because a particular kind of explosive appears to have been found in the building, therefore this was done by the US government or by some agency. It could even have been done by the terrorists who flew the plane, which would be any investigators starting to take that. Or it might be another terrorist group altogether. It's not the first time people have gone for the World Trade Center. So these are some of the elementary difficulties you would have in starting to investigate things like that. And you've got to put yourself in the mind of some overworked investigator. And he gets 100 crank calls every day. I used to get all the time. Every so often they were right. 99% of the time they weren't right. And I was much more active in investigating these things than most were. because I knew it could happen. And if I was given clear evidence, then I would investigate a little bit. And if the evidence stood up, I would investigate a bit more. And I would start asking the other side some questions. And if they gave me evasive answers, then I would home in. That's what I did with all things. The moment I was given bullshit on the other side, I started.
Sure. Do you have an example of a dossier that I could look at?
Well, I mean, I can't show you any of mine because they're
no,
classified.
but
the
somewhat famous.
The way you do it is, I mean, these things of course never end up in the public domain for very good reason.
Sure.
But the way it is classically done is you have at maximum 2 A4 pages, widely spaced, which tells the whole story. Tells it in a straightforward, unemotional, very clear way. We allege this because this, and we have the following evidence. If you're right, then the following. Do that. 2 pages. Then you have a more detailed description. The way I usually tell people is in chronological order. Dates, times, places, names, who, what, where, when, why, who, and all of this. How. Who, where, when, what, how. And you do a chronology, putting everything in date order. What you know, how you know it, what date it happened, so that you have a complete, very straight, chronological sequence of things. And then you have a sort of detailed chapter which sets out the whole thing in rather more detail. That might be 10 to 20 pages. And that has references to chunks of evidence which have been taxed as annexes to the main 10 to 20 pages.
And you put all that evidence in. You don't reference websites. You put the evidence in.
No, because websites are not evidence of anything.
Sure.
And anyone who starts putting websites,
sure,
immediately they go straight in the trash can first and anything else. You actually have to produce original documents, or copies usually. You have to make sure they're certified copies, if they are copies, so that somebody who had valid access to that document validly copied it and signed it and did so. It has to be properly presented. It's hard work putting together a dossier. And it's no good just saying, well, we've had this professor here who said there was explosive in the building and therefore the government was guilty of a crime. There's an awful lot of steps in that argument that don't actually follow, and you can see that for yourself. So you would have to establish, by getting an independent explosives expert to look at the evidence, that your professor wasn't completely out to lunch. Because if you get somebody else to look at it, it multiplies the weight of the
It's peer reviewed.
Yeah, I know, that's not enough. You have to go to somebody else. Peer reviewers can all be in the pockets. Go to somebody else, check again. And you you've still got the problem. Okay, so there was explosive found there, if there was, which again I find surprising but not impossible. And then you've got to establish who put it there. How do you know? I bet you haven't got the slightest evidence of who put it there. Have you? There's your problem.
Well,
you know, so they found explosives on the scene of a terrorist incident. Big deal, is what most people will say to that. What do you expect to find? What do you find in 99% of all terrorist incidents organised by Muslims over the last 50 years? You find explosives on the scene. Hey, that's not new. These are the problems. It's not just enough to find the explosives, you've got to say, right, who put them there? It's no good saying, oh, well, they're US Army explosives that only could have done through Fort Detrick.
So you're saying we have to do our own investigation?
You have to do enough to establish that an investigator ought to investigate.
We've done that, but we just haven't put it in a dossier.
Well, you have to put it in a form which a busy man can look at those 2 pages in 5 seconds and get an idea of whether this is complete rubbish. And if you can't tell him who put the explosives there, then you're finished. At that point, even if there were explosives there. When we find out, you saw the state of the buildings after the damn thing completely blown out or knocked down or whatever happened to it. There was absolutely no way anybody was going to be able to go through that and sift for evidence of who blew it up. So,
well, they weren't allowed to.
They did. It wouldn't. There was no point. Absolutely no point. If a building is destroyed to the extent to which those were destroyed, the whole damn thing. I watched them on the television. The whole damn thing pancaking down.
There was no pancake.
There was so well. I watched it happen, so I know that it was pancaking.
I'd love to show you a video that disproves that.
Well, I've seen the video, so I know what it looks like. And that's what happens when you blow up a building of that kind. If you hit it with a sufficient explosive force at a sufficient altitude, you will set up a standing wave through the structure, which will eventually disintegrate it. It'll just see, it's exactly what I would have expected if I'd been
So
trying
the
to blow it
metal
up.
would disintegrate?
Yes, absolutely.
Really?
Yeah.